All right, good evening. Glad that everybody could be here. If you're online and streaming with us, we're glad you could join us. Doing something kind of different. We're going to look at Leviticus, which is one of those books that nobody really likes to read. It's one of those old law books that you get into, and I was reading it today, and it was talking how you take a pigeon and how you pull its feathers off, and you do all these different things, and it just is hard for us as Christians to try to comprehend all the details in the book of Leviticus in the Old Law. The reason I wanted to do this way is because we're going to look at 3 videos tonight. 2 of them are looking at Leviticus itself. One of them, they're kind of overlapping each other. They're from Bible Project, but they're not the same. They're a little different, but I think the reinforcement, they're only 7 minutes each. And I think it'll help you to see the overview. The way they do it graphically, I love the way they do it because it helps you to see the breakdown of the book, the logic, and how they flow. So we're going to look at the book of Leviticus and discuss it. And then we'll have a little discussion in between. And we're going to go and look at an overview of the book of Hebrews. And since I've been preaching through the book of Hebrews, and I just think it's something that's something important to be able to understand the richness of the book of Hebrews is understanding some of these Levitical laws that we don't have a connection with. So I see Chelsea, she's with us tonight. She's not in town, but we miss you. Hope you get back safely. And I know the Haynes are out there, they were telling me. So we're going to have an opportunity tonight for some good discussion online. So we'll, as you do, think up some questions if you want to hold them and tell in between the videos so that we can then, I can address them and discuss them. We'll try to pull it all together and hopefully give you a better understanding of why the Old Testament is still really important for us, and that the Old Testament is fulfilled in the gospel. The old law is fulfilled in the gospel, and that it just didn't kill it, do it away. It doesn't devalue it at all. And I think that's what the book of Romans tries to show, and especially the book here as well. Lacey, okay, good to see you with us too this morning, afternoon. Okay, so we're going to watch these 2 videos, and they're back-to-back, so you'll see a little bit of a transition and go to it. If you want, take some notes, and then we'll discuss it afterwards. Let's go ahead and get started on the videos.
Book of Leviticus. We know you've been avoiding it because it's weird, so let's fix that. Now remember, the story of the Bible began with humans in God's presence, but they were banished because of their rebellion. However, God wants to be in relationship with us, so he chooses one family that he will use to restore the world back into his presence.
And so God's presence comes to dwell in a tent right in the middle of Israel.
And that's great.
But it creates a problem because it's so intense that Moses can't go in, and other priests who enter inappropriately, they die.
Well, wait, if God's presence is good, how is it all of a sudden dangerous for people?
So think of it this way. God's presence is like the sun. It's pure power and goodness. And when something mortal and corruptible gets close to such pure power, it's destroyed. And so the word holiness is used in Leviticus to describe God's pure and powerful presence, which, like the sun, is both good and dangerous. So the point of Leviticus is to show how corrupt Israelites can live near God's goodness without being destroyed. Now, in the book, there are 3 ways for how this is all going to work out, and these are going to seem strange to you, but just hang in there with us.
The first one is rituals. The second is this idea of the priesthood, and the third is a bunch of purity laws.
Now, the book is broken up into 7 sections, and each solution is explored in 2 sections of the book. The rituals are here, the priests are here, and the purity laws go here.
Now, the first solution, rituals, involves a lot of animal sacrifices. And so Leviticus begins with detailed instructions for how to make these sacrifices. Some are ways of saying thank you to God, and others are simply ways of saying, I'm sorry.
And here at the end of the book, there are some more rituals. These are about observing sacred days and festivals. They're all celebrations that retell some part of the story of how God rescued Israel and set them apart from the nations.
The second solution to the holiness problem has to do with priests. You see, being directly in God's presence is really dangerous. So he appoints priests as special representatives who can go into his presence on behalf of others.
So in this section, we have a story about how the priests are ordained into the priesthood. And then this other section explains the set of higher standards that the priests have to live by because they work so closely to God's presence.
The third solution in the book is all about purity laws. And this is by far the hardest thing to understand. For example, in this section, we're really concerned with knowing whether you're clean or unclean.
Or another way of saying that is being pure and impure. And here's what we need to know to understand this. When you're in a pure state, you can be near God's presence. When you're in an impure state, you can't. And so it was really important for Israelites to know what state they're in at any given moment.
So the first thing we have is a list of pure and impure animals.
Yeah, this list of animals is divided up by where they live. So on the land, in the sea, in the air. And the text is just not clear about why certain animals are impure or why touching or eating them makes you impure. What is clear, however, is that avoiding these creatures will set Israel apart, and it will remind them that God's own holiness should affect every part of their lives, including what they eat.
After the food laws, we get a lot of random rules about things like skin disease, touching dead bodies, what to do with bodily fluids.
But they're not random. All of these are things that the Israelites associated with life and death, which are sacred things because God is the author of life.
Okay, but simply coming into contact with these things makes you impure?
They do, but we have to keep in mind that it's not wrong or sinful to be ritually impure. You just wait a few days, take a bath, offer a sacrifice, and you're pure again. What is inappropriate is entering into God's presence when you're in an impure state.
Now, there's more purity laws over here in this section.
Yeah, these focus on Israel's moral behavior. So these are laws about social justice, healthy relationships, having sexual integrity. Living by these laws will make Israel into a morally pure people who can live near God's presence.
Those are the three solutions. Now, you've probably noticed that they surround the very center of this book, and it's here that we find a really important ritual called the Day of Atonement.
Yeah, so Israel's a big tribe now, and odds are there's a lot of sin happening that goes unnoticed, that people are not dealing with. And so one time a year, the priests would take 2 goats, and one of those goats is killed, and its blood is carried right into God's presence where it symbolically covers or atones for Israel's sin.
Yeah, that's kind of weird.
Well, the meaning of the sacrifice, it's explained in the next chapter, where God says that the blood of a creature is its life. And so this goat's life is offered as a substitute. It's receiving God's punishment for Israel's sin so that the people don't have to.
That leaves the second goat.
Yeah, the priest puts his hands on it, and then he confesses all of the sins of Israel. It's like he's placing the sins on the goat. And then that goat gets cast out forever into the wilderness. It's called the scapegoat.
Yeah, I've heard that word before.
Yeah, it's this very powerful image of how God is graciously removing Israel's sin.
But let's be honest, sacrifices in general seem so barbaric.
We have to remember that in the ancient world, sacrifices were the main way of buying favor from the gods. But the problem was that those same gods, they're unpredictable, they're fickle, you never know if they're going to ignore you or they're going to turn on you. And so it's in this cultural setting that we see Israel's God as totally different. He does get angry about human corruption, but it is never arbitrary. And he loves people. So he provides this clear way for Israel to know with confidence that they are forgiven and that despite their corruption, they are safe to live near his presence. And so that makes the book of Leviticus actually a revolutionary statement in its day.
So that's Leviticus. But Israel's still at Mount Sinai in the middle of the wilderness. They need a place to live.
Yes, the land God promised to Abraham. And so the journey to that land is what the next book of the Bible is all about. Hi, this is Tim.
And this is John.
We believe the Bible is telling one overall story from beginning to end. And so we're making videos about each individual book of the Bible, its unique design and message, and then how it fits into that overall storyline.
We also make theme videos where we take one biblical theme and we trace it from the beginning of Scripture all the way to the end.
We're a nonprofit, and we want to give all these videos away for free. So you can join us in making them by going to jointhebibleproject.com. You could give a one-time gift, a monthly gift, a few dollars, a lot of dollars. Anything will help, and we'd love you to join us in making these.
If you go to our website, you can download a full resolution version of this video, play it in your church or school or whatever. We also have study guides to help you get through the content with other people. It's all for free at jointhebibleproject.com.
The book of Leviticus. It's the third book of the Bible, and it's set right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery, when God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai and invited Israel into a covenant relationship. Now, they had quickly rebelled and broke that covenant, and God had wanted for his glorious presence to come and live right in the midst of Israel in the form of this tabernacle. But Israel's sin has damaged the relationship. So, at the end of the previous book, Exodus, Moses, as Israel's representative, could not even enter God's presence in the tent. The book of Leviticus opens by reminding us of this fundamental problem. It says, "The Lord called to Moses from the tent." So the question is, how can Israel, in their sin and selfishness, be reconciled to this holy God? That's what this book is all about, how God is graciously providing a way for sinful, corrupt people to live in his holy presence. Now, let's pause for a second and explore this really important idea that God is holy. It's fundamental to understanding this book. The word holy means simply to be set apart or unique. And in the Bible, God is set apart from all other things because of his unique role as the creator of all, as the author of life itself. And so if God is holy, then the space around God is also holy. It's full of his goodness and his life and purity and justice. So if Israel, who is unjust and sinful, wants to live in God's holy presence, they too need to become holy. Their sin has to be dealt with. Thus, the book of Leviticus. Now, the book has a really amazing symmetrical design. It explores the three main ways that God helps Israel to live in his presence. The outer sections are descriptions of the rituals Israel was to practice in God's holy presence. The next inner sections focus on the role of Israel's priests as mediators between God and Israel. And inside of that are two matching sections that focus on Israel's purity. And then right here at the center of the book, there's a key ritual, the Day of Atonement, that brings the whole book together. The book concludes with a short section where Moses calls on Israel to be faithful to this covenant. Let's dive into the book. The first section explores the 5 main types of ritual sacrifices that Israel was to perform. 2 of these were ways that an Israelite could say thank you to God by offering back to God these symbolic tokens of what God has first given them. 3 other sacrifices were different ways of saying sorry to God. So here an Israelite would offer up the lifeblood of an animal while confessing that their sin has created more evil and death in God's good world. But instead of destroying this person, God, of course, wants to forgive them. And so this animal symbolically dies in their place and atones, which means it covers for their sin. And so through these rituals, the Israelites were constantly being reminded of God's grace, but also of his justice and of the seriousness of their evil and its consequences. The second set of rituals lays out the 7 annual feasts of Israel. And each of these retold a different part of the story about how God redeemed them from slavery in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. And by celebrating these feasts regularly, Israel would remember who they were and who God was to them. Now, the sections about Israel's priests, you have Aaron and his sons first ordained to enter into God's presence on behalf of Israel. And then in this matching section, we find the qualifications for being a priest. The priests were called to the highest level of moral integrity and ritual holiness because they represented the people before God, but then also represented God to the people. Now, we find out why the priest's holiness matters so much back here in this first section. Right after the family of Aaron was ordained, 2 of his sons waltz right into God's presence and flagrantly violate the rules. And so they are consumed by God's holiness on the spot. It's a haunting reminder of the paradox of living in God's holy presence, because it's pure goodness, but it becomes dangerous to those who rebel and insult God's holiness. And so it's important that Israel's priests become holy, and also that all of the people of Israel become holy, which is what the next inner sections are all about. Chapters 11 through 15 are about the ritual purity required of all the Israelites, and chapters 18 through 20 are about the moral purity of the people. Here's what's underneath all of this purity and impurity language. Because God is holy and he's set apart, the Israelites need to be in a state of holiness themselves when they enter into his presence. This was called being clean or pure. God's presence was off limits to anybody who was not in a holy state, and this was called being unclean or impure. Now, an Israelite could become impure in just a few ways: by contact with reproductive body fluids, by having a skin disease, by touching mold or fungus, or by touching a dead body. Now, for the Israelites, all of these were associated with mortality, with the loss of life, which gets us to the core symbol of all these ideas. You become impure when you're contaminated by touching death, so to speak. And death is the opposite of God's holiness because God's essence is life. Now, this is really key. Simply being impure was not sinful or wrong. Touching these kinds of things was a normal part of everyday life. And impurity was a temporary state. It just lasted a week or two, and then it's over. What was wrong or sinful was to waltz into God's presence carrying these symbols of death and impurity on my body. Don't do that. Now, the last way of becoming impure was by eating certain animals, and the kosher food laws are found right here in this section. Now, there have been lots of theories about why certain animals were considered impure and off limits. To promote hygiene or to avoid cultural taboos, the text just isn't explicit. But the basic point of all of these chapters is really clear. Altogether, these work as an elaborate set of cultural symbols that reminds Israel that God's holiness was to affect all areas of their lives. This corresponding section over here is about Israel's moral purity. The Israelites were called to live differently than the Canaanites. They were to care for the poor instead of overlooking them. They were to have a high level of sexual integrity, and they were to promote justice throughout their entire land. Now, here at the center of the book, we find a long description of one of Israel's annual feasts, the Day of Atonement. Odds are that not every Israelite's sin and rebellion would be covered through the individual sacrifices. And so once a year, the high priest would take 2 goats. One of these would become a purification offering and atone for the sins of the people. And the other was called the scapegoat. The priest would confess the sins of Israel and symbolically place them on this goat, and then it would be cast out into the wilderness. Again, this is a very powerful image of God's desire to remove sin and its consequences from his people so that God can live with them in peace. The book concludes with Moses calling Israel to be faithful to all of the terms of the covenant. And he describes the blessings of peace and abundance that will result if Israel obeys all of these laws. He also warns them that if they're unfaithful and dishonor God's holiness, it will result in disaster and ultimately exile from the land promised to Abraham. Now, if you want to see how Leviticus fits into the big storyline, it's helpful to look at the first sentence of the next book of the Bible, Numbers. It begins, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent." So we can see that Moses is now able to enter God's presence on behalf of Israel. The book of Leviticus, it worked. So despite Israel's failure, God has provided a way for their sin to be covered so that God can live with sinful people in peace. And that's what the book of Leviticus is all about. The book of
We'll keep working through this. So let's talk about Leviticus because it's, like I said, it's one of those books that we don't like to really dig into and understand. And I know myself, for the longest time, I'd always say, well, I don't need to know Leviticus. I don't need to know any of that stuff. So why do we have to learn it? But without it, we lose a lot. We lose a lot about what it's about and what God is trying to teach us. And yeah, you're going to show up at heaven, and God's not going to go, okay, Ron, how many goats? How many goats do you have to have? What did we do with those goats? And things like that. It's not going to be like that. But the richness of what we gain from understanding the old law. And the way it hit me was when I started preaching, I didn't really want to go and teach the prophets, especially Ezekiel. Wow, that was one that was just overwhelming. And when I started teaching the minor prophets, I had this amazing understanding of that is God's personality. And listening to the prophets speak, you can hear God's character coming through them. Yeah, you got this message and it's consistent, but even through every one of them, Micah, Malachi, Ezekiel, all of them, you hear God's character, our Father. And we learn so much about him that way. Well, the same thing is true when it comes to Mosaic Law. If there's one thing that even at the end of those two together, and I know they kind of overlapped, but they were a little different, and that's what I wanted to show, especially that first one, the idea that the separation from God is a bigger problem than we can imagine. We had this perfect union with God, but we couldn't fix it once sin entered. We were separated from him. So God used to walk with us in the garden. Remember that? Remember that part of our relationship? Not a problem. We could dwell in the presence of him. But once sin entered, we were separated. And we find these sacrificial processes going on through the patriarchs. We don't really have any other specific detail written down about how a person prior to Moses, what they had to do. Were there feast days? Was there a Sabbath rest before Mosaic Law? We don't know. We know they're sacrificing, and we know that there was a right sacrifice and a wrong sacrifice. We know that much, and we know that the heads of the fathers, or they're called patriarchs, would offer it for their families as well, and serve, in a sense, we'd use this word, a priest. Job is one very specific, where we read about how Job was offering sacrifices for his family on a daily basis. So he was serving as a priest, somebody who would intermediate between God and himself and his family. So we don't have a lot of that detail coming up, but all of a sudden, the beauty of the Mosaic Law was that it started to bring forward the idea of us being separated from God, and how could we join back with God. When he brings out the Hebrews out of slavery, and he brings them through, and when they're after the 50 days of travel, they arrive at Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, they spend about a year there. During that year is when the book of Leviticus is pulled together, and the law is given over this period of time. Book of Numbers is the one that starts right after that, when they start. Key thing I want you to think about. Remember what he said in verse 1, chapter 1 of Leviticus. God spoke to Moses from the tent. Numbers chapter 1, verse 1 says, God spoke to Moses in the tabernacle, in the tent. So there was a problem even once they built the tabernacle about who could go in there, who could get that close to God. And I love that kind of imagery of try to get close to the sun. What's going to happen? You burn up. You cannot exist there. And so God went to this extraordinary effort to do several things. One, to demonstrate to us the severity of our lifestyles, our sins, and how much it has forced God to push us back. It's not, God's fault. It's our fault. And then how much effort God has put into place to pull us towards him through the Mosaic Law. And just look at all the detail. We look at the tabernacle. We look at all the items, the articles that were in the tabernacle. We look at the number of feasts, the 7 feasts that they went through. All this different, like I was saying earlier about, even if a person offered a pigeon, that they were to pluck the wings and put the feathers in a certain spot, And they had all this just, unbelievable detail. And it depended on if it was an animal from a flock or a herd. And then where they put the blood on the altar. And we read that and we just go, that's just, what does that have to do with us? Well, if there's another thing you get about this is how hard it would be to, one, understand it, two, to live under it. And that it took that much effort to just get one person into the Holy of Holies that could go and offer sacrifice of blood, first for himself, and then he came out, he offered another sacrifice, then he took blood, he went back in between the mercy seat on the ark, and he put blood there for the people. And that was once a year. And all of this was to do what? It was to allow us to have a person that could intermediate for us. So Aaron, or whoever the high priest was at that time, was the one that would offer these sacrifices and intermediate for us before God. And there's a lot of things now, I hope, maybe if you've been following me with the class of Hebrews, that you can start to see and go, because remember I talked about Hebrews and how Hebrews was talking to Jews who clearly understood Levitical law intimately. And so as the Hebrew writer starts to present what he does, it's hard for a Jew to sit there and go, I don't get it. I don't get it. Because they knew it inside and out. So they knew everything about what he's talking about. We don't. So we miss a little bit of the greatness of that book by not having some familiarization with Leviticus. And that's why I wanted to bring this up, because I've been preaching it on Sunday mornings through through Hebrews. So we're going to take a look at the overview of the Hebrew book, the same Bible project, and then we will come back and try to connect those and bring Hebrews, because that's what we want, as Christians. That's where it's applicable to us. But let's bring Leviticus in it together. So let's go ahead and watch the video 2.
The letter to the Hebrews. The author of this letter is anonymous, and people have wondered for a long time whether Paul wrote it or maybe one of his co-workers like Barnabas or Apollos, but really we just don't know. In chapter 2, we discover that the author had a first-hand relationship with the disciples who were themselves around Jesus, so we know that this letter is anchored in the teaching of the apostles. We also don't know who the audience of this letter was or even where they lived. The author knows them really well, and he assumes that they have a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, especially the storyline of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, about how Abraham's family became the nation of Israel, about how Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they received the Torah and they made a covenant with God, where they built the tabernacle, where the priests offered sacrifices, and also about how they wandered through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. The author just expects that the readers know all of the details about these stories, and so most likely the audience is made up of Jewish Christians. That's where the name of the letter comes from. We also have clues from chapter 10 that this church community was facing persecution and even imprisonment because of their association with Jesus. Some in the community were walking away from Jesus and abandoning the faith altogether. And this explains the purpose and the structure of this letter. First, there's a short introduction, which is followed by 4 sections where the author compares and contrasts Jesus with key people and events from Israel's history. Jesus is first compared with angels in the Torah, second with Moses and the Promised Land, third with priests and Melchizedek, and lastly with the sacrifices and the covenant. And the author has 2 main goals in all of these contrasts. The first goal is to elevate Jesus as superior to anyone or anything else, showing that Jesus is worthy of all their trust and devotion. But his second goal is this: it's to challenge the readers to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So in every section, he includes a strong warning not to abandon Jesus. So let's dive in now and see how this all unfolds. The elevation of Jesus begins in the opening sentence of the introduction. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors in many different ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So the author's saying that Jesus is superior to all of the previous ways that God has revealed himself to Israel. He then makes this astounding claim that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's nature. These metaphors are making the closest possible identification between Jesus and God. So Jesus is what the rays of light are to the sun, or Jesus is what the wax impression is to the signet ring. For this author, there is no God apart from Jesus. Jesus is God become human as the Son. And it's this elevated view of Jesus that's then explored throughout the rest of the letter. In the first section, the author compares Jesus with angels, which might strike you as kind of odd, like why angels? In Jewish tradition, it was taught, based on Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, that the Torah and the words of God were delivered to Moses at Mount Sinai by angels. And so by saying that Jesus is superior to angels, the author is claiming that Jesus and his message of good news are superior to all previous messengers of God's word. And so the first warning flows from this very point. If Israel was called to pay attention to the Torah that was delivered by angels, how much more should we pay attention to the message that was announced by the Son of God? And not only that, given Jesus' status high above the angels, how remarkable is it that he gave up that high status to become human, to suffer, and to die? In Jesus, we see God's greatest glory and God's great humility as Jesus sympathetically joined himself to humanity's tragic fate. In chapters 3 and 4, the author moves on to argue that Jesus is superior to Moses, who led the people of Israel through the wilderness and built the tabernacle. Jesus is also the leader of God's people, but in him we see not the builder of just a tent, but of all creation. Then the author retells the story of how the Israelites rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, and they lost their chance to enter into the rest that God offered them in the promised land. And so here comes the second warning. If Jesus is greater than Moses, how much higher are the stakes if we rebel against him? We also are in a wilderness-like environment where we have to trust God for the future rest in God's new creation. So let's make sure that we don't rebel like Israel did in the wilderness and lose out on God's gracious offer to enter his new creation. In chapters 5 through 7, the author then compares Jesus with Israel's priests that come from the line of Aaron. Their role was to represent Israel before God and to offer sacrifices that atoned for or covered over the sins of the people. But, he points out, the priests were themselves morally flawed people, and so they constantly had to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as for everybody else's. Something more was needed. And so he then argues that Jesus was that something more. He's the ultimate priest. But Jesus did not come from the line of Aaron. Rather, Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, that mysterious priest king from ancient Jerusalem, and he appears in the stories about Abraham. We also find in Psalm 110 that the Messianic king from the line of David will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the author's whole point is this. Jesus is the ultimate priest king. He's morally flawless, he's eternally available for his people, and so he's superior to any other mediator between God and humans. And thus comes his warning in this section. To reject Jesus is to reject one's best and only chance to be fully reconciled to God, so don't do that. Which transitions us into the last comparison in chapters 8 through 10. The author shows how Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate sacrifice, superior to all the animal sacrifices offered in the temple. Those sacrifices had to be offered constantly, both daily, but also yearly on the Day of Atonement. Jesus offered his life once and for all, and it was sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world. And so the author warns the audience from walking away from Jesus. It's like turning your back on a gracious offer of God's forgiveness. Why would you do that? Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, he says, and it's the foundation for the new covenant spoken of in the prophets, where all sins are forgiven. So now that the author has elevated Jesus through all of these contrasts, this final section is one big challenge to follow Jesus. So think big picture. In Jesus, they have found God's very word. In Jesus, they have hope for the new creation. Jesus is their eternal priest. He's the perfect sacrifice. And so now they should follow all the great models of faith found throughout the story of the scriptures, and they should remain faithful to Jesus, trusting that despite whatever hardship and persecution, God will not abandon his people. That's the basic flow of thought throughout the letter, which the author calls right here at the very end a brief word of exhortation. Here's a couple of extra tips for reading this letter. Whenever the author quotes from the Old Testament scriptures, which is like every other sentence, stop and go look up the reference and read that quotation in its original context. And sometimes you'll be puzzled, but more often you'll see all kinds of extra cool connections that you would never notice otherwise. It's totally worth the effort. You should also just know that these warning passages, they're going to make you uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point. They're not there to make you afraid. They're there to show you that rejecting Jesus is foolish because he's so awesome. These warnings all serve the larger purpose of the letter, to show that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. And that's what the letter of the Hebrews is all about.
Okay, your turn. Don't be nervous. I put the mic there in case you want to say something. You don't have to. Was that a little helpful? When I think about, again, I think especially after watching the overview of Hebrews, and you start to look at the way that the Hebrew writer is bringing forward everything about Christ and how that Jesus, and it's, I love the way that the Hebrew writer writes it, because even if we don't understand Levitical law, you can pull out so much encouragement and understanding about the superiority of Jesus. And I can understand that if you were a Christian Jew of the first century and you had gone through some persecution, it would be very natural to want to go back to something you're not going to be persecuted. Because for a Jew, them to reject Judaism wasn't just something you just reject your religion like in America. In America, you can change religions all day long. I mean, okay, you might get some grief from family, and get some problems there, but you're not going to lose your citizenship. If you were a Jew and you gave up, Christ, basically you were rejecting your nationality, and you lost all privileges to it. You would also, if, by this time there's only really one tribe, but you would lose your inheritance. Whatever that tribe or whatever inheritance came from that family, you would lose it. So whatever you were going to inherit as a young Jewish person, if you went to Christ, you were giving all that up. And it would be easy to be influenced to want to give that up and go back. And it's not so different, I think, today for Christians. Maybe it's not going back to another religion per se, but a lot of times the pressures that we feel and we start to see is a subconscious or psychological persecution, indirect persecution because of your moral values, different things like this that come up. And then you see that, life doesn't just all of a sudden turn into a rose garden and everything is just fine just because you're a Christian. That's not something you're promised. And I always try to make sure I remind new Christians that this does not mean that all of a sudden every one of your problems just goes away. It doesn't do that. And so for Christians that all of a sudden start hitting problems in lives, if they're not mature, they go back. And that was one of the admonitions that he gave, was the fact that he was in Hebrews, was the fact that some of them weren't maturing. He said, while you should be teachers, some of you still need to have milk. You have not grown up. And so there was that exhortation in there as well. So I'm going to go over some of these comments. Chelsea has one that she mentioned. She said, can you imagine seeing the first dead body and what selfishness and fear came out of it to save the self from ever dying? It makes me think of waterfall of acting out in fear over time from then. I think maybe if you're talking about the first dead body as far as like Adam and Eve, maybe, or your first dead body, all of those are very shocking. It's kind of interesting. And it does remind us of our mortality. And it makes us want to cling to life as well. Lacey, she says, I always tell my Bible class students that the Old Testament is to learn by and the New Testament is to live by. I believe that understanding the Old Testament is crucial to having a deeper faith as Christians. And that's especially when you look at, I think, the way that the Hebrew writer is bringing out that superiority and showing the completion. That's why I say that we kill the old law, we kill the Old Testament, we try to say it's so non-applicable to us as Christians, but it is, because it's a fulfillment. The gospel actually is a fulfillment. It had some imperfections and things like that, but we're going through the book of Romans. Paul says no. Was it horrible? Forbid? No, it was good. Because what did it do? It established righteousness. And if we go and look, again, prior to Mosaic Law and God bringing out and specifying the children of the Hebrews as a nation and building them up and bringing them a law, they became a nation state at the Mount Sinai. Before that, they were just a race of people. But when they came to Mount Sinai and they were given a law, and then they took a land, they become a nation. And the purpose of that was not just some random piece of property. The real estate was very crucial because it was a transit route for all this traffic of different nations coming to and fro. And God wanted people, the other nations, to pass through there and to see these people worshiping the one true God. And if they were doing it right, remember the last part of it was the blessings and the curses. And God goes through and Moses delivers to them and says, look, you follow after the law, you obey it, these blessings are going to be amazing. You don't need a standing army. You don't need a king. What nation doesn't have a standing army? All of them had a standing army because they were getting attacked. He says, you don't need one because you're not going to get attacked. What nation had king? All of them. What did God establish? He was their king. And he warned them. He said, and when you get a king, he's going to tax you. He's going to take all your best stuff. He's going to take your kids, and they're going to go off to war. And he warned them. And we know they did eventually go. After about 500 years, they end up with a king. But God wanted this to be an example for people to travel and see and marvel. Because their crops weren't going to fail. They were going to have good, healthy lives. They weren't going to have all the things that were going to happen to all the nations around. They should look at this one and say, why is this country prospering that we travel through? Every time we come through here, there's no disease. They don't have an army. They have no enemies. And they'll say, well, it's because we have Yahweh. And it's because of that relationship you have with them. And that should cause them and establish the righteousness that should have shined out. Now today, that's supposed to be our light as Christians. We are the ones that should be shining that out and letting people see this. But that's what the Mosaic Law was to do. Now we know they failed, didn't they? I mean, they became like all the other nations. And every time they did, God punished them, and we see that cycle. It continually comes back around. So let's look at the purposes of that very specific sacrificial system. And again, it was about that we needed to have ability to approach God. God set it up to where we could have a priest who then would represent us before God. The best he could do was to take the blood of an animal, and like Leviticus says, it says that is life. Blood is life. Now, justice would have been when Adam and Eve sinned for God to take their life. That really was the only righteous thing. But that's mercy stepped in and God said, no, I got a plan. And so the sacrificial systems kind of started, but it needed to be a perfect sacrifice, and the goats weren't doing it. And like I described on Sunday, and I think it does fit, many of us have loans where we have these loans and we pay, we send our bill monthly to it, but if you ever looked and you see that almost all of it always goes to the interest and not the principal, you need to look. Because a lot of your loans, they don't. Your house payment is one of them. If you got a mortgage, you're going to spend, out of 30 years, you're going to spend 15 or something years just paying the interest. Yeah, principal's still there. And what happens to principal? Interest keeps building up. Not until you get the principal. The principal stays there. That's sin. Sin is the principal. The only thing that the blood of bulls and goats could do is pay the interest off. That's it. And so all those years, that's all it was ever doing. We needed the principle removed. But God already knew, because of his foreknowledge, that Christ was coming, and it was as good as done, because he was going to make it happen. So that's where you might hear this sometimes said, where it was rolled forward to the cross. Even though they were just paying the principal under the old law, and paying the interest, the principal was going to be paid by the cross. That's what is cool. And ours is paid at the cross. And we don't have to worry about interest in any of that now, because like he showed, we looked at the book of Hebrews, shows that Christ now, once and for all, gave that perfect sacrifice. But without really being able to appreciate the Leviticus and the old law and seeing how imperfect it was and how much they had to go through, and it still only paid the interest. So if you're a Hebrew and you're struggling and the writer's talking to you, it's a rhetorical question. Do you want to go back to something broke? Imperfect? Well, of course not. Well, that's what you're doing. If you go back to Mosaic Law, if you accept anything but Jesus, then it's imperfect. Everything that the Hebrew writer's been talking about, starting out with who talks for God. And that's why angels, that always used to baffle me. Why does he talk about how great he is to angels? Because, like he said in Deuteronomy, in the Hebrewic, and the rabbis see it as the angel delivering Mosaic Law to Moses. So, and then Moses was a prophet in his own. So, man, you got to get, if he's better than Moses, he's got to be better than angels. And that means that's the only one you really want to listen to. And then the writer goes through and builds up everything about him. Everything. Even the rest. When he talks about the promised land. Even whenever you wandered through, historically they understood this. They wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. And they come in there and they're supposed to enjoy this rest. They failed, didn't they? They couldn't get it. Moses and Mosaic Law and Joshua never brought them into that final rest. And that's why he says, and why do you think that he kept talking about there's another rest? Because there's another one. And it all was pointing towards the Messiah. And that's why Psalms 110 is so important to remember. Psalms 110, the Hebrew writer really just keep pulling out and bringing it in, because it talks about two aspects of the Messiah. It talks about him being a king, and it talks about the Messiah being a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And they had a struggle with that. And the Hebrew writer clears it up. He's able to show them by using Scripture that Messiah was to be both. Because as far as they were concerned, you can't get better than Aaron. You can't get better. And you can't be Aaron unless you're from the tribe of Levi, but this Jesus is from Judah. Well, how can you be both? And he pulls up Psalm 110 and says, now why did David, in the Spirit, Jesus even uses it too, say to my Lord said to the Lord, my Lord, sit at my right side, in my right hand, and then turn around and say, wait, how can you be his son? And call him that. There's a confusion there. And the Jews sitting there, and they couldn't respond. They're like, I don't get it. I don't know how he could do that. Because he's not talking about a physical child, descendant. He's talking about deity, the Son of God coming down into the genealogical flesh, but it was still showing the deity of him, but also the duality of both priest and king. So do we need a priest today? Absolutely. I can't go before God. I can't stand in his presence. I mean, and that's the whole point. Now we have a priest who never dies. He's not corruptible. He's not like these priests that kept dying and coming along and just generation after generation. And on top of that, we saw the corruption of the priesthood. Even when Jesus, during his ministry, how corrupt were they? I mean, and that, I want to share this, and then yes, if you got some things, please jump in and I will read them. It's kind of ironic because when we think about I'm going to say the Levitical priesthood actually tried to fight the Jesus priesthood, the Melchizedekian priesthood. Now that sounds a little confusing because you don't see this, but so you have, in effect, if they would have clearly understood it, the Mosaic Law, and understood Psalms 110, those priests would have knew that there's a new priesthood coming, and it's in the same order of Melchizedek. So, and if they understood Psalm 110, which they said they knew everything, they would have known that the Messiah was both a king and a priest. So what did they try to do to the new priesthood? Destroy it. The old priesthood that's supposed to be so just and so perfect actually was trying to kill and tried to kill the new priesthood, the new king. And so this type of irony there where you're seeing God trying to fulfill something and the very thing that they thought they were so righteous about, fighting and trying to stop God, but God, in spite of us, will fulfill His promises. And that's another aspect to it as well. So any thoughts? It is kind of a lot. So we'll wait, see you guys online. Give me some comments and we'll... So Emily, any comments? Don't be bashful, there's only 3 of us in the room. Did you learn anything? Okay. I guess that's the right answer, right? It's like, of course I did, Ron. I just think that it's wonderful. I mean, it helps to really help to build that up. So Lacey says, Jesus is the high priest and Christians are a royal priesthood. And there's the connection, right? Because that's what Peter says. He says, you are a royal priesthood. So it hasn't gone away. And the only time we won't need the high priest, when's that? Judgment, after it's over. Whenever Jesus returns and we go to our final destination in heaven, and then we can dwell in His presence. But until then, we can't. Because, like John points out, we are all sinners. No matter how good a Christian we are, we still sin. Chelsea says it's fun to go through all that. It is. And it's hard to try to keep it where it's easy enough for us to understand it and not too overwhelming. I think that's the challenge that I have as a teacher, is try to keep it exciting and not boring. And because the Old Testament used to bore me sometimes, it used to just, oh, here we go, Leviticus and Deuteronomy and some of those. And now it's just, and I hope maybe that'll excite you, so next time you're doing your daily Bible reading and you get to that book of Leviticus, suffer through it. Okay? Just kind of work through it. Maybe skip a little bit, when you start talking about the pigeon wings and where they all go and all this stuff. But you get the idea, that of what's going on there and the depth of it. I like what he said at the very end there, and when he gave some hints was, when you go through the book, you notice this, and that's what I'm trying to do. He said it. What I'm trying to do is he said, when you go through the book of Hebrews and you see a reference to an Old Testament, stop and go to it. Because that's what I'm trying to do. Stop. Let's go look. Because it is amazing when you see pulling that together. Like Psalm 110, one of the most used Psalms, but we just skip through it, until, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. We hear that all the time. I swear to you, an oath that you will be a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. We hear all of this, and it's amazing that how much that was a fulfillment of the law, because it was spoken by David during the law. It wasn't outside the law. And if you thought, I think about it as a lawyer, if I read that psalm, let's just say I'm a Pharisee or somebody or a high priest, and David brings me this letter, this psalm he wrote, and it's about this Messiah that's going to be king and a priest. I go, whoa, David, you need to go rewrite this. No, it can't. Because there's no Melchizedek. He's not Jewish. And he's not from the tribe of kings. The priests are Levites. David, go rewrite this. They didn't. So I know that as they read this over the hundreds of years, when they came to that one Psalm, 110, they went, like we do a lot of times with Scripture, we will read through it and not quite understand it. What do? We treat it like a speed bump. We just keep going. We'll just kind of go over it and go, I'll come back to that one later. Well, the Hebrew writer is not letting you do that. The Hebrew writer is saying, look, no, that is so important. And that's the question that Jesus used to stump them. Answer me this. It's almost like Jesus said, riddle me this, Psalm 110. How can David talk about the Lord said to my Lord that he was going to be a king and a priest? So how could he be his son if he's calling them both lords? And it says in the next passage, and the Pharisees couldn't answer him, and they never asked him another question. And Jesus even says he said it in the Spirit, which indicates he was inspired. So God was telling them, and it was during Mosaic Law, which meant then it was upholding it, it was a part of it, and you need to accept it as well. Not quite understand what you said, Chelsea. A lot of it sounds like doctor stuff too. You talking about like medicine? I'm not sure. Well, we're coming to the top of the hour. Next week, we're not going to have class. Won't be here. So, Rhett, remember that if you can. I'm not going to be here next Wednesday. I'm going to be out of town. But we will continue. I'm going to have my class from this last Sunday morning on Hebrews, this same stuff. I'm going to have it play on YouTube on Wednesday at 7. So it will, because I think it will help keep that flow, because it's going to talk about Melchizedek in that lesson I did this last Sunday. I think it'll help. I hope it'll excite you. So keep reading that book of Hebrews back and forth around the chapter 7 and 8. And as we move through it, it's going to, I hopefully, encourage you to want to know more. So, Lord willing, we'll see you Sunday morning at 9:45 for Bible study, 10:45 for worship, and then 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So, God bless, and we'll see you later.